General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Thursday, April 10, 2025. First, Natalia had been carrying the weight of her secret for far too long, and each day it grew heavier, threatening to consume the fragile peace she had built in Port Charles. She had crafted a new identity for herself, one that hid the bruises of the past and replaced them with measured grace, careful smiles, and calculated silences. But even the most well-guarded secrets eventually demand to be heard, and Natalia knew the time had come. The fear that had followed her like a shadow for years refused to be silenced any longer. It had begun to seep into her interactions with Sunny, staining moments of tenderness with hesitation, and Natalia could no longer lie to herself or to the man who had offered her comfort without condition. She chose a quiet evening, when the world outside seemed still, and the weight of the truth pressed harder than ever. With trembling hands and a heart pounding with uncertainty, Natalia revealed everything she had buried deep within herself. She spoke of Sidwell, not as a distant acquaintance, but as the man she had once called husband. It was a name she had avoided for years, a part of her history she had fought to erase. She explained how Sidwell had not only broken promises but had broken her spirit, using violence and manipulation to chain her to a life of fear. The bruises on her skin had faded long ago, but the emotional scars lingered, raw and unresolved. Port Charles had been her sanctuary, a place where she had begun to feel whole again. But Sidwell, though distant, was never truly gone. Through phone calls from unknown numbers, strange figures watching from across the street, and veiled threats sent in the form of letters, his presence still loomed. Natalia admitted she had lived each day waiting for the past to catch up to her, terrified that one misstep would pull her back into the nightmare she had fled. She hadn't told Sunny out of shame, but also out of a desperate desire to protect the fragile hope she had found in him. She didn't want to be seen as a victim, not by him, not anymore. Despite her fear, Natalia knew the only way forward was through honesty. Her confession wasn't polished or rehearsed, it was raw, trembling, and incomplete. She expected judgment, perhaps anger, or worse, a wall of silence. The idea that Sunny might withdraw, that he might see her differently, gnawed at her. But she also knew that if he truly cared for her, then he deserved to know the truth. And if he chose to walk away after learning it, then at least she would no longer be hiding in the shadows of her own life. For Natalia, that was the first step toward reclaiming her sense of agency. What she hadn't anticipated was the quiet understanding in Sunny's response. He didn't recoil or cast blame. He didn't question her choices or dissect her pain. Instead, he regarded her with a kind of steady calm that disarmed her fears. Natalia could feel her shoulders begin to relax, not because the danger had passed, but because she realized she no longer had to face it alone. Sunny had seen through the surface, straight into the vulnerable truth she had tried to bury. In doing so, he reminded her that survival didn't make her weak, it made her brave. It was a quiet affirmation, but one that spoke louder than words. In the days that followed, Natalia felt something begin to shift within her. The fear that had gripped her for so long didn't vanish, but it began to loosen its hold. She still jumped at shadows, still scanned every crowd for a familiar, threatening face, but now she had someone who stood beside her. Sunny's acceptance became a shield she hadn't known she needed, not one made of grand gestures or promises, but of presence. For the first time in a long time, Natalia dared to believe that her story didn't have to end in fear or isolation. Instead, it could begin again, with honesty, strength, and someone who had chosen to stay. Second, Tracy stood alone in the drawing room of the Quartermain estate, her posture stiff, her expression carved in stone. The news had traveled faster than she expected, but not fast enough to dull the rage that surged through her veins. The desecration of the Quartermain mausoleum was not only a personal affront but an unforgivable betrayal of everything her family stood for. It wasn't just about legacy or tradition, it was about respect, about honor, about knowing where to draw the line even in the pursuit of vengeance or ambition. And Drew had crossed that line without hesitation, leaving behind a trail of dust, destruction, and disgrace. There was no misunderstanding in Tracy's mind, this wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated act, rooted in arrogance and reckless entitlement, and Tracy had no tolerance for either. She had watched Drew maneuver his way into the family's affairs, often hiding behind a mask of civility and false goodwill. But this time, he had revealed something darker, something dangerous, and Tracy refused to turn a blind eye. For her, the family tomb was sacred ground, not only housing the remains of ancestors but serving as a symbol of everything they had endured and built. Violating it was more than an insult, it was war. Her warning had not been subtle, and it was certainly not made in haste. Tracy had never been one to hand out forgiveness like party favors, especially to those who treated the Quartermain name as a tool rather than a legacy. She had watched enough men in this family stumble, manipulate, and destroy in the name of progress. But Drew had made the unforgivable mistake of thinking he could get away with it. Tracy's silence in the past may have been mistaken for weakness, but that was a miscalculation he would regret. She was no stranger to revenge, and when provoked, her sense of justice could be both brutal and precise. There was a chill in the air around her now, not from the drafty mansion, but from the finality of her decision. She would not allow Drew to continue walking through their lives as if nothing had happened. There would be consequences, and she would be the one to deliver them. Whether through influence, power, or sheer persistence, Tracy intended to make sure he understood the full weight of his actions. She would see to it that Drew was no longer in a position to disgrace the family again, and if that meant removing him from their orbit entirely, so be it. Beneath the fury was a deep sense of disappointment, not just in Drew, but in those who had enabled his presence. Tracy had tried, reluctantly at times, to accept his role within the tangled threads of Quartermain politics. She had even defended him on rare occasions. But now, any trace of leniency had vanished. What he had done was unforgivable in her eyes, and there was no room left for redemption. Her loyalty to the family name, to the memories buried beneath stone and soil, outweighed any brief flicker of sympathy she might have once held. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, Tracy stood unyielding. The decision had been made, and there would be no turning back. Drew had made his choice, and now he would face hers. In the world of the Quartermains, mistakes could be costly, but betrayal, especially the kind that left scars on sacred ground, was a debt that would be collected in full. Tracy intended to make sure of it. Third, Jordan had been watching the storm build for weeks, analyzing every movement, every whispered rumor behind closed doors. She knew Laura was in danger, not from a physical threat, but from a political one that could destroy everything she had worked so hard to protect. Urza was cunning, ruthless, and knew exactly where to strike. By using Laura's long-standing association with Sonny, he had found the perfect weakness to exploit. With the media murmuring and the council questioning her integrity, Laura's position as mayor was hanging by a thread. And while Laura had weathered many political attacks in the past, Jordan could see that this was different. This time, the attack was calculated, and personal. Refusing to stand by, Jordan formulated a strategy, one that could not only neutralize Urza's growing influence but also expose the toxic alliance forming behind the scenes. Drew, who had once appeared trustworthy, was now aligning himself far too closely with Urza. Jordan suspected there were backdoor deals, shared ambitions, and an orchestrated effort to push Laura out of office. Her plan was simple in design but dangerous in execution: lure Drew into revealing his true loyalties, uncover Urza's hidden agenda, and present Laura with undeniable proof of the corruption threatening to consume Port Charles. Jordan knew Laura valued integrity above all else, but she also knew that in times like these, even the most principled leaders needed to fight fire with fire. When Jordan first brought the plan to Laura, she was met with resistance. Laura rejected the idea outright, unwilling to participate in what she viewed as political manipulation. She believed in justice through truth, not subterfuge, and she still held a sliver of hope that Drew could be redeemed. Her loyalty to the city, her history with both men, and her moral compass all pushed her toward restraint. But Jordan was persistent, laying out every angle, every risk, every truth that Laura had refused to confront. She didn't ask Laura to become someone she wasn't. She asked her to open her eyes to who Drew and Urza truly were. Jordan then shared the first pieces of evidence. Financial records that pointed to shady donations supporting Urza's growing campaign presence. Surveillance reports suggesting private meetings between Drew and influential donors with questionable backgrounds. And most damning of all, a partial recording of a conversation in which Drew appeared to discuss future appointments in a post-Laura administration. The facts spoke for themselves. They weren't simply trying to challenge Laura's leadership, they were preparing to erase it. And with the city's trust already shaken, any delay could mean the end of Laura's career and the fall of Port Charles into the hands of those who only saw it as a game board. Laura's certainty began to waver. She could feel the walls closing in, Urza's threats were becoming bolder, his public presence more polished, while Drew kept his distance and dodged every meaningful conversation. Everything Jordan presented to her began to form a pattern, and Laura could no longer ignore it. It wasn't just about preserving her position anymore, it was about protecting the city from a leadership built on greed and deceit. For a long time, Laura had believed that transparency and compassion were enough, but now she saw that the battle had changed. And if she didn't change with it, she would lose not only her seat as mayor but her ability to shield Port Charles from what was coming. In the end, Laura agreed, not because she wanted revenge, but because she realized that doing nothing would be the greater betrayal. Her consent was quiet, marked not by words but by the steady resolve in her eyes. Jordan didn't need more. She knew Laura was ready. Together, they would pull back the curtain and show Port Charles the truth about the men who dared to manipulate its future. And this time, the fight wouldn't be waged with political speeches or campaign promises. It would be fought with exposure, courage, and the fierce determination of two women who refused to be outplayed. Fourth, Willow had always been gentle in spirit but firm in her convictions, especially when it came to protecting her family and carving out a path that felt true to her heart. After so many months of tension and slow steps toward reconciliation, Nina believed she was finally building something with her daughter, fragile, yes, but real. However, when Nina discovered that Willow was seriously considering moving Amelia and Wiley into Drew's home, she felt the walls of that fragile bond begin to tremble. She tried to remain calm, tried to present her concerns as a mother and not as someone grasping for control, but the urgency in her voice betrayed her desperation. Nina had seen Carly's wrath before. She knew exactly how Carly reacted when she felt threatened, especially when it came to those she viewed as part of her family unit. In Nina's eyes, bringing Willow and the children into Drew's world, a world tightly bound to Carly's, was like lighting a match in a room full of dry kindling. Carly would see it as an intrusion, as a provocation, and she would retaliate in her own quiet but decisive way. Nina tried to explain this to Willow, to warn her that Carly's disapproval wasn't something to take lightly. She reminded Willow that peace within their fractured family structure was still delicate, still being rebuilt one moment at a time. But Willow didn't see it that way. Her years of fighting for independence, through illness, loss, and emotional distance, had forged a kind of inner strength that didn't easily yield to fear or speculation. She listened to Nina, but her expression remained composed, untouched by the warnings. In her mind, Nina was overreacting, letting past battles with Carly color her perception of the present. Willow believed that if her intentions were pure, if her only goal was to provide stability for her children, then no one, not even Carly, would stand in her way. She had made peace with the complexity of her relationship with Michael, and she didn't see how Drew's support should be treated as a threat. To Nina, this stubbornness felt like rejection all over again. She wasn't trying to manipulate or control, at least not consciously. She just wanted Willow to avoid being hurt by a woman who had already caused so much damage in both of their lives. But her pleas were met with resistance, and Nina began to feel the painful realization that she could not guide her daughter down the road she believed was safest. Powerless, she watched as Willow calmly, firmly walked toward what Nina saw as an inevitable collision. It wasn't that Willow didn't appreciate the concern; deep down, a part of her even understood where it came from. But she was tired of being told who she could trust, where she could live, and what was best for her children. She had earned the right to make those choices, and she was willing to face the consequences if she had miscalculated. What she couldn't accept was living in the shadow of other people's fears, Nina's, Carly's, or anyone else's. So, she moved forward with her decision, hopeful that time and kindness would soften whatever resistance might come. Left alone in the aftermath of yet another failed attempt to reach her daughter, Nina felt a familiar ache settle in her chest. She had tried so hard to be what Willow needed, a guiding hand, a voice of reason, maybe even a real mother. But once again, she found herself on the outside, watching as her daughter chose a path she could not walk beside. And this time, Nina wasn't angry. She was simply heartbroken and unsure if she would ever find the right words, or the right moment, to bring Willow back to her. Finally, the room where Vaughn had called the meeting was dimly lit, discreet, and far from the everyday bustle of Port Charles. It was her first official debriefing, and Josslyn arrived with a mix of anxious anticipation and a desire to prove herself. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and joining the WSB had felt like the logical next step in her evolution from student to someone who could make a real difference. But nothing could have prepared her for the chilling weight of the assignment Vaughn was about to place in her hands. Vaughn spoke with calm authority, his tone measured, almost clinical, as he outlined the operation. The target was a man with deep international ties, suspected of trafficking high-value medical research across borders, research that, in the wrong hands, could become a biological weapon. The mission would require deep cover, a forged identity, and prolonged separation from everyone Josslyn loved. Worse still, it came with the looming possibility of facing someone tied to past tragedies in her own family's history. The moment the details clicked into place, Josslyn felt the bottom drop out from under her confidence. This wasn't a noble adventure. This was danger, real, cold, and merciless. She tried to remain composed, nodding as Vaughn handed her the dossier, but her fingers trembled as she accepted the file. As she skimmed through the information, the photographs and intelligence reports, her heart pounded against her ribs with a fear she hadn't expected. There were no guarantees of safety, no comforting reassurances. The stakes were far greater than she had imagined, and the people she'd be expected to deceive were seasoned and ruthless. In that moment, the proud sense of purpose that had pushed her to join the WSB began to crack beneath the sheer weight of reality. When the meeting ended and Vaughn left her to process the information, Josslyn sat in silence, her thoughts spiraling. She replayed her decision to join the agency over and over, wondering if she had made a mistake. The ideals that once felt so clear were now blurred by uncertainty. She had envisioned justice, courage, perhaps even heroism, but now all she could see were the shadows of her own fear. Her love for Trina, Carly, and the life she had built in Port Charles suddenly felt like vulnerabilities instead of strengths. She wasn't sure if she could walk away from them to serve a greater cause she was only beginning to understand. Doubt crept in like a slow, suffocating fog. She had told herself she was ready, but the truth was she had no idea what she was stepping into. This mission wasn't just about espionage, it was about transforming herself into someone she might not even recognize. The person who would lie, manipulate, and endanger herself for information. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, asked to leap without knowing if there was anything waiting to catch her. And worse, she realized that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. As Josslyn closed the folder and tried to steady her breathing, she knew one thing for certain: she had chosen this path, and now she would have to find the strength to walk it. Whether or not she regretted joining the WSB no longer mattered. She was already inside the storm. All that remained was whether she could survive it, and who she would become on the other side.